Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I would like to introduce to you Bill Erickson, our speaker. Bill is the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Monmouth County with a focus on nursery, turfgrass, and agricultural innovation. He has worked in various aspects of the agricultural sector for the past 15 years, including operating his own diversified farm in coastal Maine. He has led courses focused on sustainable agriculture and soil fertility for commercial growers, homeowners, and college students throughout New Jersey and New England. Bill is currently completing a doctoral degree in plant biology from Rutgers University, and he holds a master's degree in soil science from the University of New Hampshire, as well as a bachelor's degree in biology from Stockton University. So thank you, Bill, so much, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here this morning. So today we're going to talk about native grasses for the New Jersey landscape. Part of the programming that we're getting into more in depth at Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Monmouth County and at Extension in general is looking at more native species that can have ecological benefits while improving the aesthetics of our landscape. So we're going to focus on grasses today. And thinking about, we know that our vegetable gardens and our food producing gardens are very important, but also our ornamental landscapes and how we interact with the landscape can have a lot of ecological values as well. And I think sometimes that may get overlooked, just how valuable our individual landscapes are. And this may apply to residential area or even commercial areas and parking lots. So New Jersey is this patchwork of little ecosystems, and everything we can do, no matter how small, can benefit that environment. And so our plants can help to stabilize the soil, retain water and filter water and protect against stormwater damages. They can also attract beneficial insects, which many people are familiar with, and grasses are no exception. We don't often think of the flowers of grasses as being as spectacular as many of our other flowering landscape plants, but they're actually very important for pollinators as well. Habitat and food for birds is another thing that we'll talk about, and we'll see that grasses can provide important nesting materials to create habitat, especially through the winter for birds. And then the seeds from the grasses are an important food source, as well as the insects that visit the grasses. They feed the birds too. So we can start to build this larger biodiverse ecosystem by the plants that we choose. Our landscape plants also function in an important way in carbon sequestration. So every time plants are growing, they're removing carbon dioxide from the air and turning it into leaves and roots and flowers. And so when we grow perennial plants in particular, they're concentrating that carbon, taking it out of the air and storing it in their living tissues. So another really important feature, and just purifying the air, especially for urban environments and throughout New Jersey. A lot of our landscape plants are great for collecting particulates. They can stick to the leaves of plants instead of being in the air, and creating more oxygen. So two resources that are really great for native plants. There's a Rutgers fact sheet incorporating native plants into your residential landscape. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to check that out. And then Jersey Friendly Yards has a plant database, and you can search this database and select different features. You can search for just native plants. You can turn on a filter for drought-resistant plants, deer-resistant plants, and it will give you a list with pictures and how to grow them in their growing environment. So this is a really useful database for choosing plants that meet the site's conditions that you have in your yard. This is another really cool resource that actually assigns a value to the ecological functions of many plants. And so it's for New York City, but it's a mapping of the city's street trees. And you can go to the map and see where these trees are located throughout the city. but they've actually assigned dollar values to the ecological benefits of the trees throughout the city. So you can see how greatly just having these plants exist are benefiting the environment. And just to look at some of the numbers, this is over 1 billion gallons of stormwater getting intercepted each year from the trees, and a tremendous value, over $10 million based on the lesser impacts on the stormwater infrastructure. So all of the, hardscaping and drainage and filtration that has to go to dealing with water, that is decreased by having these plants in the landscape. So tremendous value just by having plants there. So this is a cool resource if you ever want to check this out. Recently, there was also a survey by the American Society of Landscape Architects, and it was getting at, what are the trends in landscape design, and many folks may be familiar with this, and this may be the trends that you're feeling or experiencing in your own yards. But the things that people are excited about to have demand for, look at the top 3 on here. Number 1 is native plants, and number 2 is native / adapted drought tolerant species, and number 3 is low maintenance landscapes. So by far the top interests and the trends and the directions are focused on ecological functions of the plants, benefiting the environment, reducing our water and fertilizer and pesticide use in the landscape, and still having excellent aesthetics, design features. We can achieve all of this using native species. But this is just the overall trend that we're seeing in landscape design and even in the industry. So in New Jersey, we have seen also legislation to encourage more native plants along our roadways. And so this is also very encouraging because the roadways and medians, we see those getting mowed throughout the summer where it's just grasses that are growing. And this takes time and labor and fuel and machinery. And it's also not very safe for the operators who are doing this in those environments. So this legislation encourages the planting of native species that are low maintenance and encourage the ecological functions that we just talked about, as well as bringing in more pollinators and supporting that biodiversity. So it's getting creative at looking at areas of underutilized land throughout the state of New Jersey that have not been developed quite yet, and how can we use those for maximum ecological function? So the New Jersey DEP also created new stormwater rules last year. So last March, they were putting more of a focus in their stormwater rules on green infrastructure. And green infrastructure works with plants, green materials, living materials, to intercept stormwater runoff, to filter it before it gets into the drainage systems. So our rain gardens, our bioswales, things like this. And it reduces pollution, flooding, reduces runoff. And so we see some really creative designs, rooftops, and even parking lots. I keep coming back to these spaces that are often overlooked, but there's potential there to create little habitats and to prevent water going from those paved surfaces from overwhelming our infrastructure to deal with it, and to purify that water and to sequester carbon, purify the air. So all these locations are great, having the right plants to go there. And we'll see that grasses and sedges suited to these conditions that are very tough plants, low maintenance, they're a great candidate for some of these applications. Another thing I want to just put out there is the way native grasses and sedges, certain ones, are great options for lawn alternatives and ground covers. And so I'll come back to this term lawn alternatives, and we'll see examples of plants that are suited for this. So some of our grasses, are more specimen cultivars where they're really tall and showy and sort of clump forming, and a 4 to 5 foot tall switchgrass would not be the best choice for a lawn alternative. That would be a very tall lawn. You could create a meadow, little prairie system with grasses like that, but there's other options that form these mats and create this, especially for shady woodland environments, understory areas that you don't want to mow very frequently, or they can get a little bit longer. These are great options and require very little inputs or maintenance. So the last, exciting thing that I'll just mention before we actually get into doing some of the grasses and talking about them is this is a new bill that was just signed in New Jersey. So you can see this news story is from January. So this is going into effect very soon. And this is the Jersey Native Plants program. And so this is a marketing program similar to if you've ever seen, Jersey Fresh on vegetables or Jersey Grown at your garden centers. And so the Jersey Native Plants program is funding to help support nurseries and garden centers to promote native plants that are being sold. So there's an increased focus at the state level to support our growers and make these more available to everybody who wants them. So there's tremendous demand that's growing. So this is really exciting, and this is just happening right now. So we're in conversation with the State Department of Agriculture for how Rutgers can assist with this and develop the materials and education around this program. So you may have seen this term before, choosing the right plant for the right location. And this is so important because it will give you the right start, getting started off on the right foot, and it's going to encourage less problems in the future. So we want to choose plants that are going to thrive in different locations and different site conditions. So first, evaluating your site. Is this wet soil? Do you have shade? Do you have dry soil? Is it very sunny? All of these things are really important because it will help to select which plants are going to do the best there. Does that make sense? So matching up site conditions for the optimum growing conditions of the plant, and then balancing those biological requirements with what you want. So do you want a hedge or flowering species? Do you want a ground cover? So it's sort of, thinking about plant selection in a systematic way. But I add this fourth element to this when we're choosing the right plants, and that involves thinking about what functions does the plant provide for the surrounding environment. So is it a pollinator plant? Is it preventing stormwater runoff? Is it helping to stabilize soil or ground cover that will prevent weeds from growing up through? So when you put all this together, it's helpful to narrow down your choices for which plants are going to work there. And sometimes you just see a plant and like, oh yeah, I want that. That plant looks great. And then you try to find what is the best location that you have on your property for where that can work. So just putting all the puzzle pieces together to set yourself up for success from the beginning. And one thing that we also have to think of as a site condition in New Jersey is deer pressure. So just like wet, certain plants are not going to thrive in wet soil or shady conditions, there are certain plants that are not going to necessarily thrive in sites that have very high deer pressure. So I start to think about this as an actual site condition. And you probably know better than anybody how high the deer pressure is in your area, whether you have a fenced in yard or not, or the deer don't really bother things or they browse through some. So you have a good sense of what your deer pressure is, and to think of plants that, if you have heavy deer pressure, you may want to focus on certain deer resistant plants. Rutgers has a great fact sheet for this that ranks common landscape plants by deer resistance. It does not include every plant per se, and the deer don't read the fact sheet either. So if they're hungry enough, they're probably going to eat some of the things on the list. But this is important to think about, and many of the grasses and sedges that we will talk about today are largely deer resistant. So these are tough tough plants for some of the areas where deer may be a challenge. I also want to bring this up, and this is not a grass, this is Echinacea. So many people are familiar with this as one of our native plants. And I want to just mention this concept of true natives or straight genetic natives versus native cultivars or nativars. And so on the left, we see our Echinacea purpurea, open pollinated, straight native. The genetics were collected from an open pollinated source, and some nurseries in New Jersey will sell that from seeds that have been collected from New Jersey, and that's where that plant has genetically evolved. So there's going to be more variation in that. Being open pollinated can cross with others, and may look a little bit different, but there's been no additional modifications to that plant. And so the pollinators have also evolved to be able to feed on this plant. Their mouth parts, the flowering times, the flower color, all of those things have developed over time in sync together. So the question becomes, as we develop more native cultivars, do they still provide those same ecological functions as our straight native species? And the answer to that is that it depends. So you can see in the middle, this is a cultivar. This is white swan echinacea. This is really nice white echinacea. Most of the flower shape is very similar to our open pollinated plant, but the petal color is different. And so some early research has shown that this is, comparably attractive to pollinators as the original one. So because the flower shape is so similar, they're still able to feed on it, and it's a pretty close match. But if you look to the right, this pink double echinacea, still an echinacea, but it's been hybridized. It's a bred cultivar, and the flower shape has changed so much that it's not providing those same ecological services. So the pollinators were not finding this one as attractive as the original open pollinated one. So it looks cool, it's unique, but because that flower shape changed so much, it wasn't having the desired ecological function. And so I just bring this up because, and this can be completely different for every plant species, but this is the difference between natives versus native cultivars, and some of the cultivars don't necessarily provide the same ecological functions. Some do. Some may even do it better or be more disease resistant. So there's no real true yes or no to this, but it's just understanding that. When we're talking about grasses and native plants, one of the major important functions we have is supporting biodiversity, supporting native insects, and further up the food chain. So this is from the North Jersey Butterfly Association. They have a really cool website, and the link is on the page here. And these are just some of the grass skipper butterflies. There's more skipper butterflies that are in New Jersey, but these are the grass skippers. So these are butterflies that thrive on grasses and other plants as well. But native grasses are going to support the populations of these butterflies, and they're going to support the caterpillars, the young stage, the larval stage that the butterflies produce. And you may think, I don't really want caterpillars on my plants or in my garden, but these are not necessarily going to take over like tent caterpillars or something like that, but they're going to exist in small populations, and they're a major food source for birds. So for songbirds, for young developing birds, it's a protein source. So caterpillars are super important protein source for birds. And if we want to improve our bird populations, increase them, we want to do something for the birds, and we can start at the plant level, grow plants that are going to encourage the insects that are going to provide the food for the birds. And we start to have this cool impact that our role in the environment and the ecosystem, just by choosing the plants and taking care of them in the yard, are going to actually create more birds throughout the state of New Jersey. And as we start to build this patchwork in our yards, in our parking lots, the medians and the roadsides, and we can develop more and more bird populations. So this is what really gets me excited, is thinking about the ecology and the landscaping and how we can play this positive role in all of this. All right, does anybody have any questions before we move on?
Will you be going over like the maintenance of the grasses, like cutting them back and when to do that? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I think that's good. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. All right. We're getting right to that. So we're going to start talking about some of the grasses now. And last year we started to set up native ornamental grass trials at the Cream Ridge Specialty Crop Extension Station. This is the Rutgers Research Farm. And we wanted to see how these grasses can grow in New Jersey. And we have straight natives from New Jersey seed sources, and we have cultivars, and we're starting to evaluate them. And we'll look for any disease problems. We'll talk about how to divide them and get into some of the particulars to really start to see which ones are best for our area. But it also creates a space where people can come and see these grasses in, growing in full size. And as the years go on, they'll be mature. So when you go to the nursery, sometimes you just see a little grass in a 1-gallon pot or a 3-gallon pot, and you say, okay, it looks like grass. But these are very different. They have different leaf colors, different colors throughout the fall, and many different ecological functions, as we had mentioned. Now, there are cool season and warm season grasses, and this is important because they grow differently and they thrive in different conditions. So we'll talk about sedges also, which are not true grasses, but their growth requirements, their environmental conditions are more similar to the cool season grasses. So our cool season grasses and sedges are going to be more active in the spring and fall, cooler soil and air temperatures, and then our warm season grasses are really going to take off in the middle of summer. Our cool season grasses are also going to bloom early, so they're going to be early summer bloomers, whereas the warm season grasses will bloom later in the summer and into the fall. So yeah, more growth, and the cool season grasses actually slow down in the middle of summer, whereas the warm season grasses are most active during that time. And so it makes sense that cool season grasses can be more sensitive to heat stress when they're slowing down in the summer, whereas the warm season grasses really, want that those temperatures. So this also influences, transplanting times, when to divide them, and again, cool season, early spring, late winter, in these cooler times before they really start growing, or you can do it into the fall, whereas the warm season grasses, maybe wait a little bit longer, but still before they start really waking up and growing, so maybe a little bit later in the spring. When we're talking about grasses, these are some of the parts of the grass that it's important to recognize. Hopefully everybody recognizes the roots and leaves. Those are very common plant parts. But grasses also produce tillers. And so these are individual stems growing from the crown of the plant. The crown is where we have our dividing tissues. That's where all the growth happens, and sort of the center of the grass. And the kind of the most important part is the crown. That's where everything's growing out from. So the tillers grow from that. And we'll talk about bunch type grasses that will divide slowly as a clump by tillers. So we'll just start to sort of expand as a clump because more tillers are being produced around this crown of the plant. On the bottom, we see stolons. Some of our grasses may be stoloniferous, and a stolon is an above ground stem, actually. So this is a stem that will grow above ground, and then it will send new shoots at different growing points along the stolon. So those points are called nodes, and it'll send a new shoot up and new roots along that creeping stem. The other picture we see shows rhizomes. And a rhizome is an underground stem. So it's similar to a stolon, but it just goes underground instead. So if you see grasses that are spreading and seem to be popping up close to the original plant, they may be spreading underground by this stem, by this rhizome, and then it will send up new shoots and roots as it grows. So this is the growth phase of cool season grasses. And this applies to our ornamental grasses as well as our turf grasses. And you can see, as you can imagine, winter, there's not too much growth happening. But then early spring is when we start to see our cool season grasses really start to wake up and green up, put on shoot growth, put on root growth. And in the summer, they're actually slowing down. So it's not their optimum growing condition. They may even go a little bit dormant, but our cool season grasses are not going to put on a ton of growth in the summer. Once the temperatures start to cool down again, they put on tremendous, or not tremendous, but more growth in the fall and going into fall, and especially root growth. So if we're thinking about looking at our lawns and turf as an example, that's why the fall is a really good time to fertilize, late summer going into fall, because it's going to put that energy into the roots, and then that's going to support healthier plants the next spring. So understanding some of this growth phase of cool season grasses can help with our maintenance. So we want to plant our cool season grasses late winter, late spring, or in the fall, late summer in the fall. So avoiding the middle of summer and sort of the shoulder season, so cooler times when it's not as stressful for them. And these can be started from seed, many of them, or transplants, divisions once you start to get your plants more established. Most of them want a fairly neutral to slightly acidic soil pH. We'll see, well-drained soil generally, but there are some that will thrive in wet conditions, and most of them want full sun. But we'll see there's also some that can tolerate shade. So we have a lot of variability here. But one of the things that's common for just about all of the grasses we'll talk about is that they don't want high fertility. They actually won't do as well in high fertility. They'll sort of put on a ton of growth and maybe flop over. So too much nitrogen is going to result in plants that don't necessarily stand up the way they should. And so this is good because it's low maintenance, low input, but it's just a little bit different than we want to give our plants everything they need and take care of them and fertilize them, but these plants are actually not going to need very much fertility. One of the most important things for grasses and for any plant is to transplant them at the appropriate depth. So very often plants get planted too deep, and this can result in rotting issues, crown rot issues, things like that. So you got to make sure that they're being planted at the appropriate level. We don't want any of the top portion of the plant to be buried at all underground, or mulch to cover that either. So we want to keep the roots below ground and shoots and leaves above ground. And so usually if you buy a potted plant, try to keep that line where it was in the pot, try to maintain that as much as possible when it goes into the ground. And for spacing, think about how wide the plant is going to be when it's mature. So they may look small now, but some of these plants can grow and spread 4 or 5 feet for one grass plant. So understand what you're planting and give it enough space to really thrive. Giving them enough water to get established. So once they're watered in and the establishment phase is over, they can be really tough plants, but we want to get them through that sort of fairly sensitive stage. We set up drip irrigation to get them going at the research farm, and then we turn the drip off later in the season, and we mulch the beds, and this helped to retain moisture, and that's all they really need. They don't need a lot of water, and but getting them started through that critical phase is important. And we can see just some of the aesthetic values. So you may not see this when you're just purchasing potted grass plants in the spring. Remember, we're looking for grasses in the spring to plant them early or maybe in the fall, but we don't see this seasonal variation necessarily. They're not the most showy plants when we go to the garden centers. And so we can see, the blooms of our cool season grasses in the summer, and they still hold that interest throughout the winter while also providing wildlife habitat. Okay, so speaking of winter, so winter care, so cutting grasses back. This is one of the few maintenance things that will have to be done for ornamental grasses of any kind. Sometimes it's common practice to cut these back in the fall. You're doing fall cleanup and things like that. That's not necessarily bad for the plant, but it's not as good from an ecological perspective for wildlife function. So we usually encourage folks to wait until late February. So coming up now, I'll give you something to do in the garden, or early March to actually go out and cut your grasses back. And so this allows the seeds, any seeds, to persist on the seed heads of the plants, and birds can use the grasses as habitat and cover and nesting materials. Beneficial insects can lay their eggs in there. So there's a lot of beneficial functions that can come from leaving the grasses until the spring. Once the spring comes, late winter, early spring, before they really start waking up, you want to cut them back, not all the way down to the ground, because you don't want to cut into the crown tissue or anything like that. Usually 3-4 inches or so. Leaving a little more is fine too. And this is going to allow light to get in and air to circulate through the base of the plant. So this will encourage new shoots to come up, to grow easily, and to grow quickly and develop in the spring. So giving them enough airflow, cutting them back, but again, waiting until late winter, early spring to do this. And once they get too big, we'll look at this in the next slide, they can actually be divided. So grasses, being so tough, are really easy to propagate and to make more of, and to spread them around and give to your friends. So most of our cool season grasses, we want to divide them maybe every 3 to 4 years. You could do it more often, just your plants will be smaller and a little bit set back, but if you really want more, you can do that. They're tough. But every 3 to 4 years is a good idea for maintenance, because if they don't get divided, the crown can sort of start to rot out, it can thin, it can die out in the center. It's not getting enough airflow, it's too tight. So from a maintenance perspective, every 3 to 4 years is actually beneficial for the plant to divide it. We want to do this early in the spring, or later in the fall. So you don't want to do this when the plants are growing, or especially when they're not in bloom, when they're blooming. That's when the plant's actively growing or devoting resources to other things. So during these dormant, semi-dormant stages, it's the best time to do the division.
Bill, do you think that could be done now? Somebody's asking.
Yeah. If it's not too cold, you could do it now. You could do it now. The only problem, you just wouldn't want the roots to freeze. So if you were, as long as you're getting them back into the ground, that's fine, or into pots that were going to be somewhat insulated. So if you put it into a pot and just left the pots outside, there could be a chance that the pots being above ground, the roots could freeze. But if you can get into the soil and divide them, if you wait a couple weeks, I would say definitely yes. But just depends on what the weather is going to be. But coming up on this season, this next couple weeks, I would say yeah, it's a good time to do this. Usually most of the grasses we'll talk about have very little pest and disease problems if they're grown properly. So things like, encouraging airflow, not planting the grasses that want dry conditions into wet conditions, and vice versa, giving them enough light. If you can match the site conditions, there's really not too much pest and disease problems that we're going to see. But I will mention these. You may see a little bit of aphids, especially if the fertility is going too high. So just dial that back down a little bit, but nothing that's going to necessarily take the grasses down. And on the right, you see a picture of rust. And so that's going to occur also. But again, if we have reduced airflow, site conditions that are less than ideal, you might see some issues like this starting to come up. Okay, let's look at some pictures of grasses. So this is American beach grass. Yep, go
Excuse
ahead.
me, Bill. You had a picture of the grasses at the research center with mulch on them. What kind of mulch was that?
Yep, so the mulch is just a hardwood mulch. It's not dyed or anything. It's just a natural mulch, hardwood or bark mulch, something like that. We usually just try to get, yeah, the most natural mulch as possible, and to not put it on too thick, enough to cover the soil to protect from weeds, but keeping it back away from the crown and from the base of the grasses, so it's not necessarily burying them in mulch. But that's really effective. It'll break down over time, add more organic matter, prevent the weeds, and keep some of the moisture in. So yeah, good question. So this is a grass that you may have seen if you go to any areas along the coast. And usually any plant that grows in sand is okay by me. It's a tough plant that's growing in straight sand with no irrigation, very little nutrients, salt tolerant. And this is American beach grass, and this is the most common grass that's planted for dune stabilization. And I bring this up also because if we have sandy areas, you can grow this also as an ornamental grass. And so it's native all throughout the mid-Atlantic coast. Great drought tolerance, great salt tolerance. This one can spread though, so it's going to produce strong rhizomes. So remember that underground stem, and those can grow 6 to 10 feet every year. So this is why it's so good for stabilizing the dunes. We see what we do above ground, and then underground, these rhizomes are helping to sort of knit and weave the dunes together. So it's a really cool plant. And above ground, you'll see them usually growing in clumps. They get about 2 to 3 feet high, and you can see the flowering seed heads there starting to form. So providing food source, nesting materials, things like that. But so if you do want to grow this one at home and you don't want it to spread too much, the rhizome barriers can help with that, or we can appreciate it at the beach, or you can grow it in a container as well. This is one that actually will thrive in moist areas. So this is BlueJoint Grass, Calamagrostis canadensis. It's going to grow about 3 to 5 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide. Can take full sun or partial shade, but we see this, growing in wet areas, swamps, marshes, and bogs, stream margins, things like that. So this is a good option for our rain gardens. It will spread. So this is one that, if you have an area that you want to develop with more of a solid cover of this grass and allow it to create either natural wetland area or build your rain garden, your bioswales, this is a good one, another good option. Chasmanthium, this is northern sea oats. This will form a clump. It grows about 2 to 5 feet high and maybe 1 to 2 feet wide, so it's taller than it is wide. It can tolerate shade and full sun as well. It actually gets taller in full sun. And we see these seed heads that actually look like oats, so hence the name, northern sea oats. It's deer resistant, so most of these grasses, pretty much all of them, are deer resistant. It's a host plant for butterflies. And this one, though, this one can spread by seed. So you may want to cut some of these seeds before they drop, and then you can use them as arrangements inside, as decorative ornamental indoor arrangements. So northern sea oats, another option, but just being aware that this one can spread by seed. This is tufted hairgrass, Echinacea cespitosa. So this is another salt-tolerant grass, but can handle wet conditions. So our beach grass was salt-tolerant for dry conditions, and then this is an option for wet conditions that may be salty. So shade or sun, and this one won't grow as tall, so 1 to 3 feet high and 1 to 2 feet wide. So it stays a little bit smaller, and we have these dark green leaves, and then the flowers that come up, they can be either gold or silver or purple. And then you can see on the bottom how they start to age and turn a little more bronze color. So this is one that can also spread by seed. So this can be, a nice one. It can be a potential for one of those ground covers or lawn alternatives. The seeds are an important food source for birds, but it's just using these plants in the way, in the ecological way that they're designed, but for your yard. So if you don't want something to spread or, provide cover in an area, this might not be the best one. There could be better, specimen type grasses. But if you're trying to cover an area with an alternative lawn, ground cover, semi-prairie setting for wildlife, this is a good option. Any questions on the cool season grasses? Okay, we'll talk about some warm season grasses. So
Bill, I think there was one that came in on the BlueJoint grass.
Okay.
And the question is, will it tolerate clay?
Go back. Yeah, so the BlueJoint grass, if the conditions are wet, this one might do okay in some of the clay soil. So especially if you add a little bit of organic matter to it, you can add some compost. Think about, swamps, bogs, marshes. These are the natural environments that it grows in. So it can take a little bit of that, higher moisture than some of the other plants. So this one could be an option for those conditions. It wants to have a little bit of that moisture, but yeah. Okay. So thinking about warm season grasses now, these are plants that are going to grow in slightly different conditions, especially for temperature, because they start a little bit more slowly in the spring. And in the spring, you might see your warm season grasses, a little slower to wake up than your cool season grasses. You might think there's something wrong with them, but it's just their growth pattern. They're going to be a little slower to get started, but then put on tremendous growth in the summer and then slow down into the fall and through the winter. So it takes them a little longer to wake up, but once they get going, they're really productive. A lot of these we'll see are really good choices for soil stabilization because they put on a very strong root system, especially in the summer months, holding that soil together, wildlife food and habitat. And a lot of these are going to thrive in well-drained soils. So we're thinking, warm season, a little bit drier, full sun. A lot of these are going to be adapted to those conditions. They're also a little more drought tolerant overall. And we see them bloom midsummer or mid to late summer, I would say, putting on the growth and then blooming and then persisting into the fall. We also see, again, in the right conditions, few insect and disease problems. So for establishing our warm season grasses, for the most part, well-drained soil and full sun, and you want to get them in the ground before they bloom. Usually, when plants are going into their blooming time, their flowering time, it's not the best time to plant them for our grasses. We want them to focus on developing root growth and then some shoot growth and then go into the flowering phase. So we want to let them focus on getting established before they're trying to produce flowers. Again, looking at your soil test, getting your pH balanced, getting your nutrients at the right level, but not over fertilizing. They don't need a ton of nitrogen and they'll actually get a little bit floppy and top heavy if they have that. Keeping them at the appropriate depth. So you can see our hardwood mulch here, and it's coming right up to the base of the crown. So none of the above ground portions are buried here, and the roots are covered, and the part above ground is remaining above ground. So just planting them at the right depth. And some of these grasses can get very large. So some of our warm season grasses are small, but some of them can get really large, in terms of height, but also spread. So you want to make sure that you're giving them enough space that when they mature, they're not restricting one another for airflow or competing with each other. Also, knowing your species type will be important for knowing how much moisture to give them. Generally, they're going to need less water, be a little more drought tolerant, but just knowing which grasses you're planting, as we saw with our cool season grasses, some thrive in really dry conditions, some thrive in really wet conditions. So just know, what you're actually getting and match those requirements. In the early establishment phases, they may need a little more moisture. So trying to, nurse them along, get them established, and then they're low maintenance after that. Here we see a switchgrass in bloom, creating seed heads. We're going to see this summer to fall, turning brown in the winter, but again, these can persist. And even as they're brown throughout the winter, if you have these grasses, they're still providing some sort of visual interest in the garden. And then we want to cut them back 4 to 6 inches from the ground, but waiting until the spring, just before the new growth starts. So they also don't need to be divided as often as the cool season grasses. Again, you probably can divide them as frequently as you want if you want to make more, but it will just, then you have smaller plants. So keeping site conditions proper, keeping enough airflow, enough light condition, and trying not to fertilize them too much will be important for maintenance. So this is one of the first plants we'll talk about. This is big blue stem. There are 13 different species of this plant native to North America, and then there are many different cultivars that are being developed too, which is kind of exciting. So this is a really drought tolerant plant. It has a good, robust root system, and that's important for stabilizing the soil as well as carbon sequestration. So this is going to help to hold the soil together, develop strong roots, and that helps to facilitate that drought tolerance. It's a really tough plant. It can grow in poor soils, does well in garden soil as well. And you can see some of these different cultivars. So we've got Black Mountain on the top and Black Hawks on the bottom, and we have both of these out at the research farm that we're evaluating. And you can see some of the changes throughout the season, some of the visual interest and the actual flowers on the bottom. So Black Mountain, as you can see, a little more silvery on the leaves, and then Black Hawks actually turns this really cool color as it gets closer to the fall. But the flowers, I think often are underappreciated in grasses, and you can really start to see them in some of our larger ornamental grasses. Even small grasses will produce some really unique flowers, but we just don't get to see them as much. So that's a close-up of the flowers on Black Hawks. And this is going to invite pollinators in. They can use this for habitat as well. And these are, of course, deer resistant. So these are some good soil stabilizing ones, also specimen grasses. So different genus, but similar common name. This is little blue stem, also very drought tolerant, great deep roots, low maintenance. We see it flowering in August, so a little bit later into the summer that it's coming on. It's going to bring in butterflies and birds, and I'll show you some pictures of some of the visual interest of this as well. And so the Perennial Plant Association actually named little blue stem as the perennial plant of the year this year, just because, well, for many reasons, for its ornamental value, for its ecological function. It's a low maintenance plant, and it's native. So it's a really, really excellent plant. A little bit smaller than our big blue stem, so it can fit into many different garden designs, and it can be, a support plant for other flowering species that are growing up through it. It can stand alone as a specimen. It can stabilize soil. So it's lots of functions for this plant. And these are some of the cultivars that we have at the research farm. We have a collection of different cultivars of these, as well as a little blue stem that's from seed collected from New Jersey, so straight natives also. But these are two common cultivars. This is Standing Ovation and the Blues, and you can see that color change, going from late summer into fall and winter. So this is really cool, kind of dramatic color change with turning the reds and the greens. And even in the summer, you've got the green and sort of the purplish red tint to the foliage as well. So it's a cool grass. Produces the flowers, seed heads, food source for wildlife. So this is a really great one and well deserved for perennial plant of the year. All right, this is blue Grama. And I put this one up here with a little bit of it's native to North America. You can see the native range on the left. New Jersey is not necessarily included in that, but it is native to North America. So I just don't want anybody to think that I'm trying to pull a fast one on you. So that's my disclosure there, but it's native to prairies and plains, open woodlands throughout most of the United States. And this is a good plant as well. It's a really tough plant growing in these natural prairie areas. So full sun, again, really wide range of climate zones. You can see it going from Canada through Texas. So zones 3 through 10, just, that's a tough plant. It'll grow about 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. You can see these chartreuse flowers that start to form in the middle of summer. And then they create these blonde seed heads. And so that's what we're looking at in the picture on the bottom right. That's a really common cultivar is blonde ambition. And so that's what we have out at the research farm, and that's what we're seeing here. It just lights up yellow on the seed heads. And so being a prairie species, this is really drought tolerant plant. It can tolerate a wide range of soils as long as they're well drained. So again, this is one that's also not going to like wet areas. So as long as it's well drained, you should be good. It should grow really easily. It's going to bring in songbirds, pollinators, no major problems, just tough prairie plant. This is another cool one. This is purple lovegrass. And so this is the native one. There is a non-native Eragrostis as well, but this is native, widely adapted, Maine, South Dakota, Florida, Texas, Arizona. So really different conditions throughout the United States where this can grow. Can take infertile soils, poor soils. It's kind of a pioneer plant for establishment. I want full sun though, and fairly dry to moderate conditions. So it does not want to be wet or in the shade, but open field conditions, poor soils, this one will do well. This can spread by self-seeding, so it's kind of an area that you may want to have naturalize or fill in with this plant, and it can spread by stems, also rooting along the ground. If planted in the wrong conditions, we can see some pest and disease problems come up, and we've heard reports of deer digging them up and eating the stem during the winter. So I don't think they're going to eat all of them necessarily, but if you think about it from an ecological perspective, this plant was widely adapted throughout much of the country, and deer used it as a winter food source. Okay, this is a specimen plant. These are great. This is Muhlenbergia, pink muley grass, and we see a white cultivar on the bottom. So the top one is just the straight species, and the bottom one is a white cultivar called White Cloud. And so this is a native. These are really cool, and there are more cultivars of this as well. So this is a clump forming grass, and you can see just the blooms that it produces late in the season. This is fall, late summer to fall bloom time. Really ornamental, spread throughout the country, Massachusetts to Kansas, down to Texas, and 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. But you can see this clump form. Can take a little bit of shade, but it's going to do best in full sun and well-drained soil. It's very tough. It's resistant to heat, drought, and deer. It's got a great root system, so it's good for erosion control. It doesn't spread by rhizomes. You can divide it in the spring. So not many insects problems with it. So this is a nice choice for, if we're looking for replacements for some of the non-native ornamental species to be an actual specimen grass, this is a nice option. Switchgrass, Panicum virgatum. So this is another clump forming grass. It mostly grows as a clump. It sort of has weak, small rhizomes that can spread, but it's going to more stay as a clump. These grow really efficiently in terms of sequestering carbon and biomass during the summer. They're really low maintenance, good for erosion control, and there's lots of cultivars and breeding work that's been done on switchgrass. So butterflies and birds use this. They eat the seeds. It's deer resistant, and this is a good replacement for miscanthus. So it's a non-native grass that can sort of escape and invade forest floor, road edges, things like that. So switchgrass is a good option. And these are just some of the cultivars. There are many. We have all three of these out of the research farm. You can see sort of this upright growth habit, clump forming. On the left, you see Shenandoah and that little bit of red tinged to the leaves, to the tips as it's starting to flower. So that's a nice feature. In the middle is a different cultivar, Cape Breeze. So this is a dwarf cultivar and also a little bit more on the blue-green side as opposed to that red color. And then on the right, Heavy Metal, which is more of an upright cultivar. So just some options, and there's more also. There's, this is one of the more commonly bred and developed native ornamental grasses that are on the market. So it's just finding the ones that you like and that fit your conditions. This is another panicum, but this is different. This is coastal panic grass, Panicum amarum. So it's related to switchgrass, but this one's a little bit different. This is cool. We have out at the research farm, we have straight native species from New Jersey. And this we see also incorporated into sand dune plantings. So your American beach grass is going to be the dominant species in sand dunes, but then if you see sort of a big clump, a taller grass out there at the beach, it's usually this plant, the coastal panic grass. So clump forming, again, drought and salt tolerant, deep roots, erosion control. And we can see this one has a cool bluish green color and it grows very quickly. So we put in little 1 inch or probably 2-inch plugs in the spring, and they were 4 feet tall and probably 2 feet wide by the end of the season. So this is a fast growing plant. And the seeds are an important food source for birds going into the fall and through the winter. And all that biomass provides good nesting material, and deer don't go for it. So this is a cool plant if you have a good location for it. Oops. This is another one that's really good for sort of naturalizing or ground covers, alternative lawn areas. This is Prairie Dropseed. So another prairie plant. So, and this, you can see on the bottom, this really cool concept for, this ground cover. It's kind of like an alternative lawn. You've got a path going through, keeping the weeds down, and it has filled into these areas. So it's going to grow 2 to 3 feet tall. It has a fibrous root mass. The foliage turns nice colors in the fall. And, if we look on the top picture on the right, you can see it in a mixed planting too. So on this hillside, mixed with other perennials, we can see how that sort of provides a foundation in that landscape design. Full sun, well-drained soil, can do dry and rocky conditions as well. Drought tolerant. It's good for pollinators and birds, and deer resistant. No major problems with this one. So good dry conditions. A pretty tough plant. All right. Any questions on our warm season grasses?
Bill, you had mentioned that pink muley grass will take a little bit of shade. Are there any other grasses that you know of that will take shade? Any native grasses?
Yeah, some of these will take a little bit, but they'll do better in full sun. Once we get into the sedges, These can really take some shade. So if you want something that's going to thrive in shade and actually won't do well in full sun, stay tuned for the next 15 minutes because the sedges may be a great option for that.
Okay, great. And also, 2 questions about the little blue stem. It is a clump forming grass, right? So it doesn't spread a
Right.
whole lot?
No, not a whole lot. And I mean, any plant, they're well behaved. They might have a little bit of rhizome growth, or you might find some coming up a little bit, but none of these are necessarily going to take over, with the exception of the ones that I mentioned, that are going to, maybe reseed and naturalize in an area. But yeah, the little blue stem, those are pretty well behaved.
Okay. And also, when you cut that little blue stem back, how far do you cut it back?
I'd leave a good 4 inches or so above ground. You just want to make sure you're not cutting into the crown, you're not cutting too much down. And wait till the spring, give it 4 inches.
Okay. Would Prairie Dropseed be good in a hell strip? I'm not really sure what that is.
That's the area between the street and the lawn, like that little, and the
Gotcha.
sidewalk, that little horrible area.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a tough plant that could do fine there. Sure. I never heard that term before.
Yeah, me neither. That was good.
That sounds like Irene to me.
No,
It's
that wasn't
accurate.
Master Garden.
Oh, okay.
Bill, I have a property, I think this is wet site tolerant. I have a property on a bay. It floods several times a year. My Montauk daisies do okay, but the wetlands grasses that wash in are vigorous and spread by surface shoots that need to be pulled constantly. I'm guessing that's Phragmites. The dirt is 6 to 10 inches below a layer of stone and gravel. What are the best grasses to plant that will not take over, but will still survive living in gravel and getting flooded with salt water? I mean, the beach grasses, you did go over some wet site.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, it's different. Oh, there's wet sites and there's sites that flood occasionally. So if it's dry and well drained most of the time, then it's plants that can handle just that little bit of flooding from time to time, but also to be salt tolerant. So our beach grass and our coastal panic grass, those are going to be tolerant to those conditions. They may spread a little bit more than some others. We'll see also some of these sedges might fit into that role as well. But really in that environment, the plants that are naturally adapted and are going to do best are going to be some of the wetland marsh grasses. So I'm not talking about those necessarily today, but things like, Spartina alterniflora, Spartina patens, Disticus spicata, spikegrass. Those are all the plants that they're going to do excellent there because that's their native environment.
Okay, and you would you recommend any of those plants to put as a single plant in a container?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that the pink muley grass is a great one for the containers.
Yeah,
I think the little blue stem is nice for a container, and even the big blue stem, if you had, that one's going to make a taller plant. But if you have a big container, that can work as well. So those are some good options.
Okay, and then finally, now you've mentioned several times to cut the grasses back 3 to 4 inches, but a lot of times you just see them cut to like a foot. I mean, is that okay? I think they're just going to grow right through that, and that's going to shatter away. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Leaving a little more is fine, and it'll get covered up. You just want to make sure you're getting enough airflow into the system. Cutting them short enough so it's enough airflow and light to get down, but then not so short that you're actually getting into the crown or causing damage. So they're tough plants, and that's kind of why I like them too. It's kind of easy to grow, makes you feel good about yourself as a gardener. Me anyway.
Great. Okay. We're good, thank you.
I just have a comment about the pink muley grass. And a couple years ago, the Master Gardeners took a trip to Chanticleer Gardens in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and there's a mass planting of pink muley grass, and it is absolutely spectacular. We were there in October, and it is really a beautiful grass. So if anybody's looking for a nice one, that might be a good choice.
Yeah, that's a great comment. That's a really cool plant, and I think we're going to see more and more of that coming on, into gardens and at the garden centers. All right, great questions. And if I don't answer all the questions today, also, feel free to follow up with us afterwards, or if you have specific site conditions or difficult sites, always feel free to reach out to the extension office and we will work with you. All right, so next we're going to talk about sedges, which are not actually grasses, but grass-like plants. And these can thrive in some really tough site conditions as well. Now, whereas our warm season grasses, we think of those as, dry, sunny locations, our sedges, a lot of these tolerate shade and wetness. So we have those different site conditions. These are going to play a great role. They're really important for stormwater management, our rain gardens and bioswales. A lot of them are low growing and can form lawn alternatives, especially in shadier areas, but they still support pollinators. We don't often think of sedges as being this showy flowering species, but they will produce a flower that will bring in pollinators, and they produce seeds that feed wildlife, nesting sites for birds, and the deer won't eat them. So tough plants for different site conditions. And you may have heard one of the main differences to tell a sedge versus a grass is that sedges have edges, and this refers to their triangular stems. So you can see, this looks a lot different than grass blades, for example, because the stem is actually a triangle. So you can feel that, or if you cut into it, you can see this triangular shape. So that's a really key identifying feature of sedges. They're in the genus Carex, and there's almost 500 different species of Carex that are native to North America. So this is a widely adapted species all throughout the country. Cool season plants, again, they're going to have similar growth patterns to our cool season grasses. They're perennial, and we can see them used in lots of different applications. So you can see on the right there, this large ground cover sort of living mulch situation underneath our trees. You can see seed pods forming on the left and the triangular stem in the center. But there are many different types, different colors, textures, adapted to different situations, different flowers, and seed heads. And so it's just figuring out, what aesthetic you're looking for and what the site conditions you have might be. And even down to color, bright green, lime green, blue green, there's variegated cultivars. Usually we see the flowers being little spikes or spikelets, generally a tannish color. Some of them are going to have these drooping seed heads and flowers. So it's really unique, interesting plants that are appreciated in their own way. And we see these seed heads a lot of times sort of poke up above the foliage. So it gives some interesting structure. But these are the major workhorses in green infrastructure. So they're low maintenance, especially in wet areas. They're great for stormwater infiltration, stormwater mitigation, water filtration, rain gardens, bioswales. They can have different shapes. So some of them are going to look more like grasses, whereas others are going to have broader and wider leaves. Some of them will grow as little mounds, like little living mulch mounds, and we can use them then for the lawn alternatives. And when we're looking at alternative lawns or lawn alternatives, you can cut them back in the spring, just as we've been talking about, but you don't want to cut them as low as you would, a traditional turf grass lawn that you'd be mowing. So maybe, cut off a third to a half of the plant or so, and let the rest regrow the season. So it's a different look, you know, but for areas that are low maintenance or on a slope or in shady areas, or you're not walking there as frequently, this can be another option. And once they're given their right site conditions, they really don't need very much maintenance or care. So low fertilizer, you know, they don't need very much fertilizer. If anything, slow release, low rates, you know, just over time if they need it. But a lot of the times they're not going to need much. Some of them can be sensitive to salt. And you don't want to fertilize in the middle of summer. So again, remember, cool season grasses and sedges are not necessarily thriving and actively growing in the middle of summer. They do most of their growth in the spring and the fall. So I want to try to just allow them to maintain during the middle of summer and not try to push their growth too hard. When dividing them, similar to cool season grasses, early spring or fall. And we can see usually they're mostly disease and pest free, but in site conditions that are less than ideal, if the plants are stressed, we can see some minor problems start to develop. Okay, so this is a cool one. This is Appalachian sedge. This is native to the United States, and it has this clumping little mounded tuft growth habit, and they only grow to about 10 to 12 inches tall. But you can see this ground cover application that's really nice in this environment. So this is near buildings. You've got a walkway, in the very corner of the foreground, and so this is an area that's not necessarily going to be walked through, but it's maintaining living mulch over the ground cover without, it's keeping weeds down. It's having green living plants and carbon sequestration and all those ecological benefits, but it's essentially acting as a mulch for the larger trees and shrubs. So part shade to shade, so it likes being under that canopy of the trees, and it will bloom. It'll get a flower April through August. And this is a sedge that actually does not want to be too wet. So we mentioned, how they're so important for our rain gardens and wetland type areas, and we'll see some of the more common wet area sedges, but this is one that actually can take a little bit drier conditions. So I just want to highlight this one at first. And you can divide it, you can propagate it by seed. The deer won't eat it. So this is a nice one for this living ground cover. One of the more ornamental looking native sedges is the blue wood sedge. And you can see it's got this wider leaves. It's a little bit different shape and the perennial bluish color. These are actually going to stay pretty small as well, so 6 to 12 inches. And you can do these in a little container also, or mixed containers, mixed landscape beds, and they're going to form basically little clumps and small colonies because they can spread. They have those rhizomes, those underground stems, so they're not terribly aggressive, but they can start to fill in an area and form these little colonies. Part sun to shade, and these ones, they can thrive in wet conditions, but they can also take some drought, so a little more adaptable. They don't need quite as wet of conditions as some of the other sedges that we'll look at. So, but it is good for rain gardens because they can take that flooding. They can be one of the drier plants of the rain garden and tolerate periodic flooding. So nice color and leaf shape on these. Okay, so these next few sedges are the ones that we're going to want for our really wet areas. So this is longhair sedge. This is a larger plant, 2 to 3 feet tall, and it can spread up to 3 feet wide. It's got these shiny, sort of classic leaves. It's what we think of when we talk about sedges. Full sun or part shade for this one, but it needs wet conditions. And then you can see the flowers, these flower spikelets that it's producing on the bottom picture. So in July and August, it's going to produce those, and they're sort of bristly green little flower spikelets. And these are going to produce seeds that are going to feed birds, and sedge wrens a species of bird will actually make nests in sedges. So not just this sedge, but others as well. There are certain birds that utilize them for their nests. This is fringe sedge. So also tufted sedge, so grows in a little mound. And this one will get even a little taller, 3 to 4 feet high, and spreads just as much. Full sun to part shade, but again, it needs that moisture. And you can see a little bit different flower shape on the right there. And in the middle, we can see it, forming this understory in this wet woodland area. So just some different options, some different places where you can use this. One on the left is more of a coastal area on the shore, and in the middle, we're seeing this wet woodland area. So it's really adaptable as long as it has the moisture. This is Frank's sedge, named after my brother. Not really. My brother's name is Frank, though. And this one also likes wet conditions, a little bit smaller, and grows to about 1 to 2 feet, and in a mound with sort of this upright green foliage. So this is one that's nice. It's a little more, little tidier, a little bit. So good option. It's going to produce these little spiky seed heads, and wet areas, bioswales, or rain gardens. This is a nice plant as another filler to be in those spots. This is lurid sedge, another tufted wetland sedge. So again, wet conditions, full sun or part shade. It's going to grow up to 3 feet high and spread 2 feet. And this makes a clump, but a little bit less upright. So it's going to start to grow and then sort of cascade and fall over. So if you're looking for that type of look, this is a nice option. And you can see the little spikelets, little yellowish green spikelets starting to come out in late spring. Again, another good rain garden option, really excellent for root system, for absorbing water and preventing stormwater damages. Okay, so I had alluded to some of these.
There's a couple questions about the sedges.
Sure.
Are any of them evergreen?
Yeah, there are some evergreen sedge options where it's kind of one of the things that we're looking at too, is to see, based on site conditions in our area, which ones are going to do best for natives for being evergreen. So even if something says that it's evergreen, we want to evaluate it a little more so.
Okay. Also, people are thinking of nut sedge. So what's the difference between the sedges you're talking about and the weedy nut sedge? I mean, do the sedges you're talking about, they don't have the nutlet roots, right?
No, these are different plants. And some of them are, in an ecological perspective, will form a clump, in an area and spread to fill in an area because they're holding together wetland soils and filtering that water and absorbing that water. So that's part of their function in some cases, but this is not, it's not the weed that spreads, it's not nut sedge.
Okay. And then a question, what is a bioswale you had mentioned?
Yeah, so it's similar to a rain garden. It's kind of like along slopes, for example, you would create swales that are essentially like mounted terraces that are going down a slope, and then water gets intercepted into the bed. So it's like a bed going down a slope with plants in it to absorb water as it's flowing down. So it's kind of like a series of beds down a slope, going with the contour of the land to intercept water and absorb it into plants in a stepwise manner.
Okay, and we got a couple questions about the best sedges for shade, but I think you answered that, right? I know you said the Appalachian one was good for shade, and that blue one.
Yeah, a lot of these can take part shade, full sun to part shade. yeah, a lot of these will do fine in the shade. These can take shade. Dry shade is the Appalachian sage would be dry shade, and some of the others wet shade. They'll do fine.
Okay. I think please talk about Carex bunny blue sedge. It may not be a native.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're talking, I don't know if that's a native.
There are a lot of non-native sort of Asian Japanese sedges, which may be fine in a landscape, but yeah, it's mostly just focused on natives.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that one's a native.
Diane, there was one question up a little further. It says, since sedges do well in shade under trees, do they thrive where tree roots are exposed, or do they need more soil to grow?
It depends on the plant. Yeah, so if they don't have if they have only a thin layer of soil, they may not grow as large because they might not be able to develop as much of a root system. But some of the plants like the Appalachian sedge, that one might do okay because there's going to be drier conditions.
Somebody also said Carex ice dance is evergreen, but again, I'm not sure if that's a native.
Yeah, right. So ice dance is not native. Bunny blue, I believe, is native, and that one's semi-evergreen. That'll grow in shade and wet sites. So that's another option. We don't have that at the research farm at the moment. So if anybody has divisions of it that you'd like to share, then reach out to us and we'll start looking at that one a little more so as well.
Beautiful. Okay, I think we're good.
Okay. So these are just a couple of plants of non-native ornamental grasses that we see commonly, but they're starting to escape into local ecosystems. The one on the left is weeping love grass. So remember, this is an Eragrostis that's not native. So it's native to southern Africa. We do have a native Eragrostis, but it's not this one. So that one can spread. And then what we see probably most commonly is Miscanthus sinensis, and this is native to Asia. And this one, it's vigorous growing plant. It's a large plant. It spreads. It can get into the forest edges, meadows, roadsides, and then it starts to outcompete other native species. So, these are a couple that, we have so many native options that can fulfill both the aesthetic or the site condition that these would be chosen for, that it makes more sense to go with some of the natives. All right, so thank you everyone, and I'd like to thank some of the nurseries who have been supplying us with plants. So Pinelands Nursery, which is in New Jersey, they're one of the believe the largest native plant nursery on the East Coast. So check them out. They do wholesale, and then they also have a retail division where you can order native plants from them. It's called Pinelands Direct, but they've been supplying us plants, and they're great to work with. And then Hoffman Nursery, which is actually based in North Carolina, but they've been growing grasses and native grasses for over 30 years, and their website's a great resource, and they've donated plants to the research farm as well. So we appreciate them, and the USDA for we have a specialty crop block grant to continue looking at native plant species and developing more guidelines and management practices for our area. So there's a couple links here also of nurseries that carry native plants in our area. So check those out, and if you know a nursery that's not on the list, then encourage them to have their name on these lists as well, so people can find native species. All right, thanks everyone. And is there any more questions?
Yeah, they're coming in now.
All right, before we
Uh,
go to those final questions, I just want to thank everybody. And when the session concludes, there will be a excuse me, a survey that pops up in your browser. If you could take a minute to give us your feedback, it really helps us develop programs that are of interest to you, and we want to know how you like this one. So if you have any questions related to our last coffee talk or this one, please send email to that address, mgmcsymposium@gmail.com. And if you live in Monmouth County, we have a Master Gardener helpline that's open Monday through Friday. If you could just send email there with your questions, actually Diane is manning it, so you'll get a response from her. And that's mgarden@co.monmouth.nj.us. And thank you all for being here. And I'll turn it back to Diane and Bill to try to answer all the questions that have been coming in. All right.
All righty. So what's a native option for Chinese silvergrass? Which I think a lot of your talk could be replacing that, you know. On your handout, there is a list of the grasses, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
all those lists, all those plants are on there. Yeah, I think that the big blue stem, the little blue stem, the pink muley grass, those are some really nice ones. Switchgrass also, I would say those top four could fill that role.
What happens when the sedge stops drain off water? Doesn't the area become even wetter than it is without the sedge? I live in a development nearly at the bottom of a slope, and runoff water accumulates, and it is always wet after a heavy rainfall. Having a fence from the neighbor just to the right of me, the property doesn't help, but water goes under the fence too. So I'm not really sure what that.
So the plants will actually take up the water. So they'll turn it into leaves and roots and use it for growth. So there's a couple things you can do with water in a situation like that. If you can put in, drainage will get rid of the water if you want it to move away. But if you want to create plants that are going to intercept that water and keep it out of a drainage system or prevent it from flooding another area, then that's an option. And it could also be a matter of planting more further upstream too. So if all the water is accumulating at the bottom of the hill, having plants along that hill that can absorb more water before it gets all the way down there, and that's where that concept of a bioswale could come in also, is having more plants to absorb water along the way and use it before it all starts to accumulate at the bottom. So there's a couple options.
Okay, and Bill, you mentioned the research farm at Cream Ridge. That is not open to the public, so people can't just go in and walk around because there's research being done. Do you have any? Are you thinking about like open houses or something to?
Yeah, so it's not open every day to the public, but we will be having open houses out there. We'll do some twilight meetings and tours and things like that. So there's a lot of renovations happening there. We're getting things fixed up, and we're going to invite more and more people out there to see the research projects and to talk about them. So there also may be opportunities to volunteer out there. So if anybody's interested, those options could come up as well. But a lot of these plants also we have at the gardens, like the rain garden out back and at the county office. If you're in central New Jersey near Middlesex County, Rutgers Gardens, it's another public botanical garden. So other options may have some of these plants in a more public way, but we're going to invite everybody out for some open houses at the research farm.
Okay, do you have any recommendations? Oh shoot, I just lost it. Hold on. Have you noticed any native grass sedge pairings with native shrubs that you could recommend?
I think it just, it's based on the site conditions that you have. So if you have wet sites, for example, that would narrow down your choices to to your wetter plants, and then your sun and your shade. So soil conditions, sun and shade, and choosing the ones that are going to work best in those environments. So as you saw, some of our grasses are more low growing, and some of our sedges can be taller, or you can choose a taller grass and a lower sedge. So there's lots of different combinations, and then I think it comes down to also the aesthetic that you're looking for there as well. I really like using some of the grasses and sedges as the ground covers. So you could do something like the Appalachian sedge as a ground cover, and then maybe some of your taller grasses like pink muley grass or the big blue stem grasses as sort of focal point grasses throughout there, and a little bit taller, and then you can have your really any kind of trees and shrubs that would do well. And so those would be all things that would do all well in a in well drained soil conditions. So
okay, there's a question, pampas. There's a question about pampas grass, which is not native, or yeah, and I mean it is beautiful, but is it invasive? I know it's like marginally hardy here.
Yeah, it's
again, it's not a native, and that's what the talk is about. So I don't.
Yeah, I don't think it. There are non-native ornamental grasses that don't. Not all non-native grasses are invasive, I'll say. So some of them, yeah, behave in the landscape more so than others. But whenever we're working with introduced species, they may not have the same ecological benefit in terms of supporting the butterfly and pollinator and bird populations, because they didn't all evolve together. So when we're choosing native species, there's a whole biodiverse ecology of insects and birds that have evolved over time to feed on those plants and to use them as habitat and to eat the seeds. And so we're supporting those those higher level ecological functions when we choose our natives.
Okay, and I think the last question, are the native grasses generally deer resistant?
Yeah, for the most part, these are all deer resistant. Every one that we talked about in this talk. So at the research farm, we're getting this year. We have a deer fence installed, but there's heavy deer pressure out there, and none of these grasses were damaged throughout the season. We saw deer tracks going through the beds. They may get damaged from getting stepped on, but they're not going to eat them. Maybe they'll take a bite, but none of these showed any damage.
Diane, I saw one that came in from Tammy. I can't even pronounce this. Is Carex sprengeli a native for the shade? Oh, Diane, you did answer that. Yes, you said. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that.
That's okay. Will wet tolerant sedges keep the area very marshy, thinking mosquitoes in the summer?
If it's a wet area, so it's kind of like what comes first, the water or the sedges. So the sedges aren't going to make it wetter. They're actually going to use some of that water and turn it into leaves and roots and things like that. So we think about sedges and marshy areas together because that's where we see them growing, but they're not going to actually create the site conditions to make something wet. They just happen to grow in those areas. So if you're concerned about standing water, then you may want to address the site in a way to get rid of that water. And plants can help to do that, and drainage and things like that. But they're not going to necessarily make it wetter.
Okay, somebody else is asking about Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. Is any of your research have that in it?
Yeah, we do have that one out at the research farm. Yep, it's another It's a good one as well.
Okay.
That one's native.
All right, that's it. Thank you. Excellent presentation, great information.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. It was wonderful. Thank you, Diane, and thank you everyone
Thank
for
you,
being
everyone.
here. So I'm going to stop the session right now. I'm going to stop recording. Stop.